Thank you all very much. Now, I'm under the impression that I have an hour to speak. Is this correct? And I originally didn't want to use the full hour. But you guys all look like a studious bunch, so I'm going to end it. I think I'm going to use the full hour. If you guys get bored or you want to throw tomatoes or anything, at any point you can feel free to let me know. We'll give you guys a chance to rest your legs a little bit. But what I'm going to do is my lecture, it's in 3 parts. So maybe the best way to do it would be to alert you to some of the formal lecture elements when I get there, and then also some of the non-lecture elements. There's going to be one intermission in the lecture where I'm going to pause and I'm going to do something a little bit different. But I promise it's all for good reason and with purpose, and I'll return back to the lecture itself. The title of my talk is Tafsir al-Qur'an. It's an inquiry into what this is. And in many ways, I'm not going to seek to give an answer to that question. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try and problematize this so-called principle of some sorts in scriptural exegesis. And a lot of it comes from several years of working on Quranic commentaries. And what I've learned over the years is that once you get into the tafsir material, we do not, even though we think we have very good defined criteria for what makes Quranic commentaries work, and the principle of Tafsir al-Qur'an, the Qur'an is supposed to be some kind of means of access to understanding how the exegetes used to think about scripture. The truth is, it's much more complicated. Once you get into the material, I've been spent about 7 or 8 years, last 7 or 8 years, working on Qur'an commentaries. And I can say a few things. Number one, there's a lot that needs to be done. There's so much that needs to be done. And what we do have out there right now, in English in particular, it's pretty good. It's generally workable and usable. But often, as is the case with such a vast body of literature that still goes on until today, we have a very difficult time even coming to terms with what these Quranic commentators actually are doing. The long and the short of it is that they're commenting on the Quran. But once you start investigating these texts, you realize that they're unique to themselves, each of them on their own. They're speaking to a genealogical tradition that is true, but they all have their own concerns, they all have their own prerogatives, and it all comes out in very interesting ways. I'll give one example and then I'll move into the lecture. We're often told that Fakhruddin Razi, the great Quran commentator, he was a great Asharite thinker as well, and that he has engaged in something of what you call an Asharite conspiracy in his Quran commentary. So he tries to make everything conform to the theological school to which he belonged. Now, I used to take that at face value. And when I started reading Razi's tafsir systematically, I've not read the whole thing, of course, it's a very large tafsir. It's the single largest tafsir by any one individual. I realized that he's actually not doing that at all. There's a bit of that happening in the commentaries, but he often will take positions that are counter Asharite positions that he himself usually advances in other works. And he does that for a number of reasons. One of the main reasons that he'll do something like this is because he doesn't think his positions are necessarily all that defensible in the context of tafsir. Whereas in the theological treatise, a position that he takes might work. In the context of Quranic exegetical literature, when he's speaking to many voices within that tradition, the playing field changes a little bit. And so he will happily modify his views. And so there isn't really anything like a conspiracy in his works at all. He's actually just a very honest man, to be totally honest with you. He's extremely straightforward with himself. Now, we're also told in some of the exegetical secondary scholarship that some of the authors were sidestepped by the tradition of classical Sunni and Shia tafsir, again, for reasons of conspiracy or for reasons because the authors didn't consider this to be necessarily good interpretation or went against certain prevailing forms of orthodoxy or perceived notions of orthodoxy. And that too is not always the case. That's actually not true. I have in mind one particular study, which I won't mention here by name, but one author put forward an argument saying, look, there's this one major 11th century Quran commentator, and everything's in his commentary, but the tradition never took him seriously. And I worked with this particular commentary in the project that I was kind of involved with for some years. And the answer seemed pretty clear to me why the tradition never took this commentary too seriously. It's because it's not interesting. That's why. When you start getting into the material, you're like, wait, this is actually, a lot of it's repetitive, a lot of it's just, you're just citing poetry, it's not really doing anything interesting. he's not doing anything innovative, whereas Zamakhshari is much more innovative in the same time period. So I think all of this is to really problematize the notion of what commentary is and what it should be, and it's in that vein that I'm going to proceed with my lecture. Now, my point of departure this afternoon will be the classical principle, which says that some parts of the Qur'an explain other parts of the Qur'an. يُفَسِّرُ بَعْضُهُ بَعْضًا. Now, what does this actually mean? I do not wish to delve into an historical inquiry concerning the origins of this notion. Suffice it to say that the idea that parts of the Qur'an explain other parts of the Qur'an has always been a basic given amongst the Muslims. And it seems quite clear to me that we can find the same principle amongst the readers of any text, be it sacred or secular, although it can be argued that readers of sacred texts were more committed to such a position for both practical and doctrinal reasons. So in his Muqaddimah fi Usul al-Tafsir, Ibn Taymiyyah, who died in 1328, offers a perfectly logical justification for this practice with respect to the Qur'an. Incidentally, the same passage that I'm going to cite to you, it's lifted by Suyuti in his famous work on Tafsir called Al-Itqan fi Ulum al-Qur'an. And he doesn't, of course, cite his author, but it shows how prevailing this definition is in the later tradition. So Ibn Taymiyyah says, were a questioner to ask what is the soundest method of explaining the Qur'an, Tafsir, it would be answered the soundest method in this regard is for the Qur'an to be explained by the Qur'an. يُفَسِّرُ الْقُرْآنَ بِالْقُرْآنِ. Since what is generalized in one context is explained elsewhere, and what is condensed in one context is expounded upon elsewhere. Now, operationally, this means that in order to understand a word or a phrase, which is undefined in one part of the Qur'an, one must look elsewhere in the Qur'an for clarification. For example, in verse 1 of Surah 102, Surah Al-Takathur, or vying for increase, it says vying for increase distracts you. Al-Hakum al-Takathur. Now, what exactly does vying for increase takathur mean? The only other instance in which this verbal noun is used in the Qur'an is in Surah 57, verse 20. That is Surah Al-Hadid, or the iron. And the verse in question reads, know that the life of this world is but play, diversion, ornament, mutual boasting among you, and vying for increase, takathur, in property and children. يَعْلَمُ أَنَّمَا الْحَيَاةُ الدُّنْيَا لَعِبٌ وَلَهْوٌ وَزِينَةٌ وَتَفَاخُرٌ بَيْنَكُمْ وَتَكَاثُرٌ فِي الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَوْلَادِ. Now 57:20 therefore tells us that the vying for increase in question here is that which involves property and children. Thus when 102:1 of the Quran says that vying for increase distracts human beings, it means to say that they are distracted from their true purpose in life on account of their competing with others and accumulating property and offspring. And to be sure, this principle does not only extend to the use of words and phrases. It also holds true for clusters of key Quranic ideas, concepts, and themes, and this is one of the central arguments I'm going to be advancing. Now, we normally do not think of Tafsir al-Qur'an in this way, and the question is why? So, if the principle is used to gloss certain terms and concepts, that's accepted amongst the authors in the tradition, and also in secondary scholarship. What if Tafsir al-Qur'an meant something else as well? What if it allows, as an operational principle, us to look at entire units of the Qur'an as commenting upon each other, like layered commentary, so to speak. Now, I'm sure that many would have no problem with applying some kind of literary theory to the Qur'an, as has been done recently in Quranic studies with respect to ring theory, and often with mixed results. But this, as I see it, is often a second-order level of understanding, since it takes a pre-existing set of criteria that has worked successfully with other forms of literature, and then grafts this onto understanding the Qur'an. Now, what if we were to take the Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an principle seriously, or should I say absolutely seriously? I would suggest that if we were to do so, multiple layers of correspondences within the text of the Qur'an would begin to emerge in a way that would defy any neat theoretical categorizations, and which would also give us a much deeper understanding of the Qur'an on its own terms. It should be noted that I'm not going to employ the Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an principle in any new fashion. In many ways, what we call Sufi tafsir, or mystical exegesis, both of which, by the way, are severely misleading terms, already proceeds along these lines. The same applies to some of the major authors within the Islamic tradition who are working outside of the genre of tafsir proper, such as Ayn al-Qudat, Ibn Arabi, and Rumi. Ayn al-Qudat died in 1131, just to refresh your memory. Ibn Arabi in 1240, and Rumi in 1273. Now, what some observers have found to be incoherent garble in their writings is actually perfectly coherent and very much anchored in a Quranocentric view of things. Essentially, what all of these authors share in common is that they are first and foremost doing Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an in the broadest terms possible. Now allow me to move into my central argument. I will here relate this intertextual principle to two sections of the Qur'an, namely the story of Joseph, which is Surah 12, verses 3 to 101, and parts of Surah Tateen, or the fig, which is Surah 95, verses 4 to 6. More specifically, an attempt will be made to demonstrate that the Quranic story of Joseph serves as a perfect commentary upon the relevant verses of Surah Tateen with respect to both structure and meaning. But to see the story of Joseph in this light, one must assume a symbolic perspective, which is also rooted in Quranic symbolism, as opposed to the more insightful literary and dramatic approaches that are commonly applied to the story. So Surah Yusuf, or Surah of Joseph, is concerned primarily with recounting the entire story of the Prophet Joseph, who is also referred to in 684 and 4034 of the Quran, and this constitutes the longest and most continuous single narrative in the Quran. The general outline of Joseph's life and times corresponds to Genesis 37 to 46, although there are several significant differences between the Quranic and biblical accounts. The story of Joseph is said to have been revealed to the Prophet when Jewish scholars in Mecca had persuaded the Meccan idolaters to ask the Prophet about certain details pertaining to Joseph's life and legacy. According to another report, God revealed the story of Joseph to the Prophet after his companions had asked him to provide them with the story. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a summary very quickly of the story, and then we're going to come back to unraveling the entirety of the story. But let this summary kind of just linger in your minds for a little while. As the most beautiful of stories begins to call themselves the most beautiful stories, Joseph discloses a special dream he had to his father, Jacob, who warns him not to convey his dream to his brothers, because they were exceedingly jealous of him. The brothers plot to be rid of Joseph and manage to convince Jacob to allow Joseph to go with them into the wilderness. Once left in their care, Joseph is taken into the desert by his brothers and cast into a well. Joseph is eventually rescued by a caravan and purchased in Egypt by a high-ranking official, identified with the biblical figure Potiphar, or Potiphar, Tafsir. While Joseph is under Potiphar's care, his wife Zuleika falls in love with him and attempts to seduce him, but Joseph does not succumb to her advances. After false accusations before Potiphar and widespread rumors throughout Egypt of what had transpired between Joseph and Zuleika, Joseph is cast into prison. He is later exonerated, released from prison, and appointed to high office in Egyptian society. By the end of the tale, Joseph's parents and brothers come to Egypt to stay with him, and the dream he had at the beginning of the story is fulfilled. So that's the bare bones summary of it. As for verses 4 to 6 of Surah Tateen, they read as follows. Truly we created man in the most beautiful stature. Then we cast him to the lowest of the low, save those who believe and perform righteous deeds, for theirs shall be reward unceasing. خلقنا الإنسان في أحسن تقويم ثم رددناه أسفل السافلين إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات فلهم أجر غير ممنون. A common explanation of 95:4 is that human beings were created in the image of God, in accordance with the prophetic saying God created Adam in his form. خلق الله آدم على صورته. 95:5 is interpreted as a general stated belief from which only those mentioned in 95:6 are excluded. Now, according to the great philosopher Sadruddin Qurnawi, who died in 1274, another way to understand these verses in that surah is that the self, created in the divine image, enters the downward flow of the cycle of existence and becomes trapped in it, namely the lowest of the low. Yet only a few are able to escape this trap, thereby ascending the circle of existence and returning to their original state in the divine image. It is this more metaphysical reading of these verses with which we will be working eventually. Now, at this point, allow me to rephrase again my central argument, which will, I hope, unfold as the lecture continues. Taking the story of Joseph's different characters as so many symbols of the self, this tale presents us with a vivid history of the human soul, from its origin to its fall, and then to its return to its source. However, we are not here taken through the life of just any human soul. Rather, the history in question is concerned with that soul which has attained perfection. This is precisely the journey of the soul that is recounted in 95:4-6 of the Quran. The story of Joseph is therefore a symbolic representation and dramatization of those verses in the Quran, 95:4-6. This kind of approach largely hinges on what Maria Dekaki calls a circular reading of history in the Quran. That is, where the end of the account is already contained in the beginning, and where the remainder of the story presents us with the gradual unfolding of the tale, taking us from its point of origin, the mabda, to its return, the mahal. Now, this reference to historical understanding in the Quran goes back to two forms of history that have been identified in the text of the Quran in modern scholarship. One is that it's linear, that history can be linear in the Quran, so we have a progression, beginning, middle, and end. And often that's where a number of historical questions come up concerning the historical reliability of the accounts, and all of these kinds of things come up because of the linear reading of history. The other approach is something called the cyclical understanding of history. And normally what that is it looks at the different stories of the prophets in terms of narrative, and it tries to situate the happenings in their lives and against, number one, the backdrop and the context of the life of the prophet himself. So it's kind of like archetypal, like what Moses went through, the prophets going through, so on and so forth. And it also looks at all the stories of the lives of the prophets and tries to show that it's the same theme that's recurrent over and over and over again. Prophets come, sent by God to people, they reject the message, they're warned, and they're punished, and so on and so forth. But then the circular reading of history, not the cyclical, the circular reading, tends to look at things as already contained in the very beginning of the narrative. This is kind of a new way that history is conceived in the Quran, and I'm sure it's going to be catching on soon. If you look at a number of verses in the Quran from that perspective, you come away with a very different sense of just the narrative voice in the commentary, in the passages in question. So if you consider all three notions of history as working simultaneously with one another, then you have a much wider playing field and a very different kind of understanding of history in general, and then sacred history in particular as it relates to the Quran. Now, what I'm going to do at this stage, this is the part where it's somewhat unconventional, I'm going to actually read you a translation of the story of Joseph in the Quran, which is, like I said, verses 3 to 101. So it's quite a long section of my lecture, where I'm just going to read you a translation. But this is from the forthcoming study of Quran, so some of you guys are some of the first people to hear this new translation. And the reason I insist on just reading the translation is that what I'm going to say later on, in many ways, can only make sense if all of the individual characters and components of the story are clearly fleshed out. So I thought there would be no better way to do it than just to read the translation itself. So please brace yourselves. I hope that this exercise is as edifying for you hearing it as it was for you writing it. In the name of God, the Compassionate, the Merciful. Alif, Lam, Ra. These are the signs of the clear book. Truly we sent it down as an Arabic Qur'an that happily you may understand. We recount unto thee the most beautiful of stories, by our having revealed unto thee this Qur'an, though before thou wert among the heathens. When Joseph said unto his father, O my father, truly I have seen 11 stars, and the sun and the moon. I saw them prostrating before me. He said, O my son, recount not thy vision to thy brothers, lest they devise some scheme against thee. Surely Satan is a manifest enemy unto man. Thus shall thy Lord choose thee, and teach thee the interpretation of events, and complete his blessing upon thee, and upon the house of Jacob, just as he completed upon thy forefathers, Abraham and Isaac. Truly thy Lord is knowing wise. Certainly in Joseph and his brothers there are signs for the inquiring. Remember when they said, surely Joseph and his brother are more beloved unto our father than we are, though we are a group. Surely our father is in manifest error. Slay Joseph, or cast him out to some land, that your father's concern might be for you, and be thereafter a righteous people. One among them said, slay not Joseph, but cast him into the depths of the well, that some caravan might pick him up, if you would take some action. They said, O father, what is with thee, that thou dost not trust us with Joseph? Surely we wish him well. Send him forth with us tomorrow to frolic and play. We shall surely be his keepers. He said, truly it grieves me that you should go with him, and I fear that the wolf may eat him, while you are heedless of him. They said, if the wolf should eat him while we are a group, then we would surely be the losers. So when they went with him and agreed to put him in the depths of the well, we revealed unto him, verily thou wilt inform them of this affair of theirs, when they are unaware. And in the evening they came weeping unto their father. They said, O father, we went racing with one another, and left Joseph with our things, and the wolf ate him. But thou wilt not believe us, even if we were truthful. And they brought forth his shirt with false blood. He said, Nay, your souls have seduced you in this matter. Beautiful patience, and God is the one whose help is sought against that which you describe. And when a caravan came along and sent their water carrier, and he let down his bucket, he said, Good news, here is a boy. So they hid him as merchandise, and God knew well what they were doing. And they sold him for a low price, a number of dirhams, for they valued him not. The man from Egypt who bought him said unto his wife, Give him honorable accommodation. It may be that he will bring us some benefit, or that we may take him as a son. And thus did we establish Joseph in the land, that we might teach him the interpretation of events. And God prevails over his affair, but most men know not. When he reached his full maturity, we gave him wisdom and knowledge. Thus do we recompense the virtuous. But she, in whose house he was staying, sought to lure him from himself. She locked the doors and said, Come thou. He said, God be my refuge. Truly he is my Lord, and has made beautiful my accommodation. Verily the wrongdoers will not prosper. She indeed inclined towards him, and he would have inclined towards her, had he not seen the proof of his love. Thus it was that we might turn him away from evil and indecency. Truly he was among our sincere servants. And they raced to the door while she tore his shirt from behind, and they encountered her master at the door. She said, What is the recompense for one who desires ill toward thy wife, save that he be imprisoned or a painful punishment? He said, It was she who sought to lure me from myself. And a witness from her people testified, If his shirt is torn from the front, then she has spoken the truth, and he is among the liars. But if his shirt is torn from behind, then she has lied, and he is among the truthful. So when they saw that his shirt was torn from behind, he said, Verily this is among the schemes of you women. Your scheming is great indeed. Joseph, turn away from this, and you seek forgiveness for your sin. Truly you were among those at fault. Some women of the city said, The viceroy's wife sought to lure her slave boy from himself. He has filled her with ardent love. Truly we consider her to be in manifest error. So when she heard of their plotting, she sent for them, and prepared a repast for them, and gave each of them a knife. And she said to Joseph, Come out before them. Then when they saw him, they so admired him that they cut their hands and said, God be praised. This is no human being. This is not a noble angel. She said, This is the one on whose account you blame me. I indeed sought to lure him from himself, but he remained chaste. And if he does not do as I command, he shall surely be imprisoned, and he shall be among those humble. He said, My Lord, prison is dearer to me than that to which they call me. If thou dost not turn their scheming away from me, I shall incline toward them, and be among the ignorant. So his Lord answered him and turned their scheming away from him. Truly he is the hearing. Then it occurred to them, after they had seen the signs, that they should imprison him for a time. Now 2 young men entered the prison with him. One of them said, Truly I see myself in a dream pressing wine. The other said, Truly I see myself in a dream carrying bread atop my head, from which the birds eat. Inform us of its interpretation. Truly we see you as being among the virtuous. He said, No food with which you are provided will come unto you, save that I shall inform you of its interpretation before it comes. This is among the things my Lord has taught me. I forsake the creed of a people who believe not in God, and they who are disbelievers in the hereafter. And I follow the creed of my fathers Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. It is not for us to ascribe any partners unto God. That is from the bounty God has bestowed upon us and upon mankind. But most of mankind does not give thanks. O my fellow prisoners, are diverse lords better, or God, the one, the paramount? You worship apart from him not but names that you have named, you and your fathers, for which God has sent out no authority. Judgment belongs to God alone. He commands that you worship none but him. That is the upright religion, but most men know not. O my fellow prisoners, as for one of you, he shall serve wine to his Lord, but as for the other, he shall be crucified, and the birds will eat from his head. The matter about which you inquired has been decreed. And he said to one of them whom he knew would be saved, Mention me to your Lord. But Satan caused him to forget to make mention to his Lord. So he remained in prison for several years. And the king said, Verily I see in a dream 7 fat cows being eaten by 7 lean ones, and 7 green heads of grain, and others dry. O notables, give me your opinion on my vision, if you can interpret visions. They said, What confused dreams? And we are not experts in the interpretation of dreams. Now the one who had been saved among the 2 said, remembering after a while, I shall inform you of its interpretation, so send me forth. Joseph, O truthful one, give us thine opinion concerning 7 fat cows being eaten by 7 lean ones, and 7 green heads of grain, and others dry, that happily I may return to the people, that they might know. He said, you will sow diligently for 7 years. Then whatever you harvest, leave in its ear, save a little which you eat. Then after this will come 7 hard years, which will devour that which you have saved in advance for them, save a little of that which you have stored. Then after this will come a year wherein people will be granted succor, and wherein they will press wine and oil. The king said, bring him to me. So when the messenger came to him, he said, return to your lord and ask him, what of the women who cut their hands? Surely my lord knows well their scheming. He said, what was your purpose when you sought to lower Joseph from himself? They said, God be praised, we know no evil against him. The viceroy's wife said, now the truth has come to light. It was I who sought to lure him from himself, and verily he is among the truthful. This is so that he may know that I betrayed him not in his absence. Truly God guides not the scheming of the treacherous. But I absolve not my own soul. Surely the soul commands to evil, save whereon my Lord may show mercy. Truly my Lord is forgiving and merciful. And the king said, bring him to me, that I might reserve him exclusively for myself. Then when he had spoken with him, he said, truly this day thou shalt be of high rank, and trusted in our presence. He said, send me over the storehouses of the land. Truly I am a skilled keeper. And thus did we establish Joseph in the land, that there he might settle wheresoever he will. We cause our mercy to fall upon whomsoever we will, and we neglect not the reward of the virtuous. And the reward of the hereafter is better for those who believe and are reverent. And the brothers of Joseph came and entered upon him, and he recognized them, while they knew him not. And when he had arranged for their provisions, he said, bring me a brother of yours from your father. Do you not see that I give full measure, and that I am the best of hosts? But if you bring him not unto me, you shall have no measure from me, nor shall you come nigh unto me. They said, we shall seek to lure him from his father, that we shall surely do. He said to his servant boys, put their merchandise in their saddlebags, perchance they will recognize him when they have gone back to their people. Perchance they will return. So when they returned to their father, they said, O father, the measure has been withheld from us. So send our brother with us, that we might obtain the measure. We shall surely be his keepers. He said, should I entrust him to you as I entrusted his brother to you aforetime? But God is the best of keepers, and he is the most merciful of the merciful. And when they opened their belongings, they found their merchandise had been returned to them. They said, O father, what more do we seek? This is our merchandise returned unto us. Now we can provide for our family, and keep watch over our brother, while getting another camel load. These are meager rations. He said, I will not send him forth with you till you give me a solemn pledge before God that you will surely bring him back to me, unless you are surrounded. So when they gave their solemn pledge, he said, God is guardian over what we say. And he said, O my sons, enter not by one gate, but enter by separate gates. Yet I cannot avail you aught against God. Judgment belongs to God alone. I trust in him, and let those who trust in him. And when they entered from whence their father had commanded them, it did not avail them aught against God, but it fulfilled a need in Jacob's soul. Truly he was possessed of knowledge because of that which we taught him, but most men know not. And when they entered upon Joseph, he drew his brother close to himself and said, truly I am your brother, so be not distressed on account of that which they used to do. When he made ready their provisions, he put the drinking cup into his brother's saddlebag. Then a herald cried out, O you men of the caravan, truly you are thieves. Turning toward them, they said, what are you missing? They said, we are missing the goblet of the king. For whosoever brings it forth, there shall be a camel load. I shall be its guarantor. They said, by God, you certainly know that we came not to work corruption in the land, and we are not thieves. They said, and what will be the recompense for it if you be liars? They said, its recompense will be that he in whose saddlebag it is found, he himself shall be its recompense. Thus do we recompense the wrongdoers. Then he began with their baggage before the baggage of his brother. Then he removed it from his brother's baggage. Thus did we devise a scheme for Joseph. Under the king's law, he could not have taken his brother unless God willed. We raise in degrees whomsoever we will, and above every possessor of knowledge is a ruler. They said, if he has stolen, a brother of his had stolen aforetime. But Joseph kept a secret in his soul, and disclosed it not unto them. He said, you are in a worse position, and God knows best concerning that which you describe. They said, O Viceroy, he is a venerable aged father, So take one of us in his place. Truly we see you as being among the virtuous. He said, God be my refuge, that we should take any save the one with whom we found our property. For then we should surely be wrongdoers. So when they despaired of swaying him, they conferred privately. The eldest of them said, Do you know that your father has taken a solemn pledge from you before God, and earlier you neglected Joseph? Thus I shall not depart from this land till my father grants me leave, or God renders judgment upon me, and he is the best of judges. Return unto your father and say, O father, verily your son has committed theft, and we bore witness to that which we knew, but we are not keepers of the unseen. So ask the town wherein we were, and the caravan with which we approached. Verily we are truthful. He said, Nay, your souls have seduced you in this matter. Beautiful patience. It may be that God will bring them to me altogether. Truly he is the knowing, the wise. And he returned away from them and said, Oh, how great is my grief for Joseph. His eyes had turned white with grief, and he was choked with anguish. They said, By God, wilt thou go on remembering Joseph till thou art ill to the point of death, or till thou hast perished? He said, I complain of my sorrow and grief to God alone, and I know from God that which you know not. O my sons, go and inquire about Joseph and his brother, and despair not of God's comfort. Truly none despairs of God's comfort, save the disbelieving people. So when they entered upon him, they said, O Viceroy, affliction has befallen us and our people. We bring but meager merchandise. Yet grant us full measure, and be charitable unto us. Truly God shall recompense the charitable. He said, Do you know what you have done with Joseph and his brother when you were ignorant? They said, Art thou indeed Joseph? He said, I am Joseph, and this is my brother. God has been gracious unto me. Verily, whosoever is reverent and patient, surely God neglects not the reward of the virtuous. By God, they said, God has preferred thee over us, and we were at fault. He said, There is no reproach against you this day. God will forgive you, and he is the most merciful of the merciful. Take this shirt of mine and cast it upon my father's face. He will come to see, and bring me your family all together. And as the caravan set off, their father said, Truly I sense the scent of Joseph, if you think me not senile. They said, By God, truly thou art astray as of old. And when the bearer of glad tidings came, he cast it upon his face, and he was restored to sight. He said, Did I not say unto you that I know from God that which you know not? They said, O Father, seek forgiveness for us from our sins. Truly we were at fault. He said, I shall indeed seek forgiveness for you from my Lord. Truly he is forgiving, merciful. So when they entered unto Joseph, he drew his parents close to himself, and said, Enter Egypt in security, if God wills. And he raised his parents up to the throne, and they all fell prostrate toward him. He said, O my father, this is the fulfillment of my vision. My Lord has made it come true. He was good to me when he brought me forth from prison, and brought thee from the desert, after Satan incited evil between my brothers and me. Indeed, my Lord is subtle in that which he wills. Truly he is the knower, the wise. My Lord, thou hast given me something of sovereignty, and taught me the interpretation of events. Originator of the heavens and the earth, thou art my protector in this world and in the hereafter. Take me as a submitter unto thyself, and admit me to the company of the righteous. So that's the full story of Joseph, and I hope at minimum that it's planted the seed of just some of the characters in your mind. If I achieve that much, then what's to follow will, I think, make more sense. And then second, we'll continue in a moment. Does anybody have any questions before I continue at this stage? There are a lot of discussions in the commentary literature that I, of course, won't be able to touch upon. And I really had to hold my tongue as I was reading the translation. There's some really interesting interpretive strategies that the commentators suggest. I'll give you one of them just to give you an idea of how complex the commentaries can be, although I'm not going to be concerned with that level of understanding here. In that passage where the women speak about Zuleika, Potiphar's wife, and they say that it seems like they're complaining or that they're questioning her virtue, but Joseph's, he's really made this woman Zuleika, go head over heels for him, and how wrong that is. That's generally how the commentaries tend to read the understanding of what the women are saying, and so they show up as a result of a challenge that she puts forth, saying, look, I'm doing what anybody would do in a situation like this. Look how beautiful he is. And then they all end up cutting their wrist. But according to at least one interpretation that I've seen, if you read between the lines, this commentator suggests that what's actually taking place there is that the women are actually critical of her, not because she sought to seduce him, but because she didn't seduce him properly. And it's actually very interesting. I mean, it totally works. So they're actually critical of her because they think she's a weakling. And so they show up taking up her challenge, and they're like, well, we're going to show you, this is how you seduce a young man. And they appear, and they also lose the challenge. So that's, some things like that, unfortunately, we won't be able to get into here. Yes, I see a question.
I just want to ask you one more time that when you were translating, how would you translate وَلَقَدْ هَمَّتْ بِهِ وَهَمَّ بِهَا لَوْلَا أَن رَأَىٰ بُرْهَانَ رَبِّهِ.
Yeah, right. So the way it's been translated here is that, do you want me to read you the translation properly, just so I don't misquote it? Let's see. So it says, this is a verse 24, she indeed inclined towards him, and he would have inclined towards her had he not seen the proof of his Lord. So that gives me an opportunity to mention the aforementioned Razi. One of the reasons why I put forward the view that Razi takes positions that are counter his own theological school is in the interpretation of that verse. Rather than try to defend it like many commentators do, because the wording is very clear, he would have inclined towards her according to the doctrine of Isma, or the infallibility of the prophets, which is standard fare in Ash'arite theology. The prophets cannot sin. So he's kind of struggling with that, and then there's the text of the Qur'an that seems to suggest that this would have happened, but there's some proof that was lingering in the background that he saw. Some of the creative literature, especially Persian texts, have very different explanations of what that proof was. I can't go with it, it'll take me way too far afield. But as for Razi is concerned, he says, yeah, that makes total sense, that he would have inclined towards her, because he says that it's kind of like a man who's fasting. So these are Persian, so he'll use Persian in very often. He says that a man who's fasting in the sweltering heat of the day, middle of the day, if you bring him rose water, you put it before him, he'll be naturally inclined to drink the water. His tabi'ah, his nature will want to drink the water. But he understands that there's the ruling of the fast over him, which forbids him from drinking the water, so he won't do it. And he goes, that's exactly what happened to Joseph. He naturally inclined towards it, but he didn't do it because of the ruling of the Sharia over him. And by taking a position like that, and several other Ash'arite authors also do the same, he's slightly moving away from a more hard and fast Isma position. Something that seems to acknowledge that the prophets have these natures that are very much like what regular human beings go through. So I'm glad you asked that. I wasn't meaning to share that particular interpretation with you, but there's a lot of other very, very interesting discussions that come about just because of that one interpretation. Someone could probably write a PhD thesis just on the different views that verse has engendered. There's some very interesting discussion there. Anyway, so let me now turn to the reading that I've been promising you. So with the basic outline of Quran 95, 4-6, and the story of Joseph in place, let us see how this symbolic reading of the tale will come together. So again, I'm using the story of Joseph to demonstrate that according to the principle of al-Qur'an, that some parts of the Quran comment upon other parts, that story is really like a commentary upon these verses from Surah At-Tin. Just to mention the verses to you again, we created a man in the most beautiful of statures, then we reduced him to the lowest of the low, save those who believe and perform righteous deeds, for them shall be a reward unfailing. So, Joseph represents the human self or the soul in its terrestrial or fallen state, which is a natural and necessary aspect of the life of any human being. What the self is in Islamic thought would itself require lengthy inquiry. Suffice it to say here that by self I simply mean what we normally identify in Islamic text as the human being as such, namely the inward nature of a person. We can also refer to the self, or more commonly aspects of the self, as the spirit, the ruh, or the heart, qalb, but these two terms need to be situated against the backdrop of a number of complex cosmological and metaphysical doctrines. Thus, for purposes of clarity and consistency, we will only employ the terms self and soul here with reference to the human being in all of its states. As a symbol of the human soul, Joseph first discloses his dream to his father Jacob in verse 4. As will become clear in due course, We can understand Jacob's function in the story here as corresponding to human intelligence, namely a person's ability to discern the nature of things on a deep and essential level, as opposed to the more general quality of ratiocination or cognition. We shall return to the meaning of Joseph's dream once its actualization comes about at the end of the story. But for the meantime, it should be noted that the skill Joseph will eventually learn is ta'wil, namely the ability to interpret dreams, or what the Qur'an calls the interpretation of events in verse 6 in that same surah. Ta'wil indeed refers to the process of interpretation, but literally denotes the idea of taking something back to its origin. Thus, ta'wil in Islamic sources is often understood to refer to, in quotation mark, esoteric scriptural exegesis, that is the uncovering of the original and inner dimension of the outward form of the Qur'an. The reason I put esoteric in quotation marks is because the word ta'wil, in the early part of Islamic exegetical literature, was just a synonym for tafsir. That's why Tabari's famous work in tafsir has the title of ta'wil in it. So it later on comes to take on a different meaning. By extension, it is seen as the ability to return to the original meaning of any event and circumstance. Applied to the human being, ta'wil refers to the ability to grasp the original nature of the self, or what we would more generally call the signs of the soul. Therefore, Jacob's words in verse 6 to Joseph, "Thus shall thy Lord choose thee and teach thee the interpretation of events and complete his blessing upon thee," tell us that Joseph will eventually learn the signs of the soul, and this acquired knowledge will clearly be a result of God's having chosen him. Since Jacob symbolizes intelligence or discernment, he is already aware of the meaning of Joseph's dream. But the fallen aspect of the human being is unaware of this science, insofar as a fallen being. It thus must go through the process of recovery in order for it to come to know what it has always known, but which has become obscured on account of the fall. How we know that the story's beginning implies some notion of a fall from grace or heaven of the human being is that both discernment, that is Jacob, and the soul, Joseph, are conceived as two separate entities. The more coalesced they are, the more the seemingly disparate aspects of the human being are integrated. And the more integrated the human soul, the closer he is to his original nature, namely the divine image in which he was created. Jacob tells Joseph that his vision should not be disclosed to his brothers, lest they devise some scheme against him. Verse 5. The brothers here represent the lower aspects of the soul in general, that is, the negative tendencies within the human being, normally referred to texts of Islamic psychology as the nafs, or the ego, which is the sum total of the negative states of the soul. By protecting the vision from his brothers, Jacob, or human discernment, reflects the awareness that one should not squander the possibility for self-realization, symbolized by the vision, by giving in to the lower possibilities of the self, namely the ego. So again, I'm encouraging you to think of all of these figures as not historical personalities, but as all the competing aspects of a drama that's taking place within the human being. Now there is a clear tension between human intelligence and the ego, as seen in verse 8. Hence the desire on the part of the brothers to be rid of Joseph, so that, as the verse says, your father's concern might be for you, and be thereafter a righteous people, can be read as the false promises that the human being, Quan Nafs, ego, gives to itself, that it will come under the purview of the intelligence, and live a righteous life, once the ego reigns supreme and is fully satiated. Jacob, with the intelligence, is all too aware of the trickery of the nafs, and thus is rightfully suspicious of it. The main reason Jacob gives to the brothers for not sending Joseph along with them to, as they state, frolic and play in verse 12, is that in verse 13 they say that the wolf might eat him while you are heedless of him. As something that devours what stands in its path, the wolf represents the world as such, or the dunya. In other words, if the soul is in the state of being heedless, in verse 13, of its true nature, symbolized by the brothers taking charge of Joseph, this worldly life will devour it, leaving it in ruin. We now turn to a key symbol in the Quranic account of the story of Joseph, figuring as it does 3 times in the story. This is like one of the main characters in the story. The symbol here is, of course, Joseph's shirt, qamis. As Todd Lawson, who I'm sure is not unfamiliar to all of you, as Todd Lawson notes, Joseph's shirt itself functions as a key character, standing, as he says, as a symbol or emblem of the passage of time, and narrative development, and by association, all narrative continuity. Thus, in each instance in which Joseph's shirt appears, we are encountering the same shirt, but in 3 different guises. The first time we encounter Joseph's shirt is in verse 18, where the brothers, as the verse says, brought forth his shirt with false blood. The shirt here represents the soul's purity. It's a white shirt, which the soul wears or carries until it is torn away from it by the brothers, the nafs. Without his protective garment of purity, the brothers or the nafs throw Joseph or the human soul in the depths of the well, verse 15, which clearly symbolizes the spiritual ailments. In the bottom of the well, the soul is now in the lowest of its possible states, precisely the lowest of the low mentioned in Quran 95:4, as for the Safilin. Then with the stain of falsehood, symbolized by the blood which the brothers or the nafs placed upon the shirt in verse 18, the shirt in its sullied state is presented to the intelligent Jacob as normal. With the human plunged in spiritual infirmities, the ego is victorious. The human intelligence will not accept the defeat of the self by the ego. The soul then rises from its lowest of all possible states and is saved by the people of the caravan who valued him not, in verse 20. The reason they did not value Joseph, the soul, is because in the symbolism with which we are concerned, they represent time, which has no need of the soul as such, since time is indifferent to what takes place within it. Thus, over a period of being trapped in the well or one's spiritual ailments, the soul gradually awakens to its lowly state and begins to resurface, seeking to purify itself and escape the trap in which it has been placed by the ego. Verse 22 speaks of Joseph as attaining full maturity and being granted wisdom and knowledge by God at that time. In verse 21, we are told that Joseph is purchased by the man from Egypt, who is referred to as the viceroy, Aziz, 2 times in that chapter, verses 30 and 51. As we have already seen, he is identified in Quranic exegetical literature with Potiphar in the biblical account of the story of Joseph. Now, Potiphar clearly sees in Joseph something that others do not see, and that is why he can represent insight, basira. Recall that when they find him, or when they purchase him from the caravan, he tells his wife that maybe we'll benefit from him or we'll take him as a son. Those same words, incidentally, are uttered by Pharaoh to his wife when they discover Moses in the Quran. The exact same words elsewhere in the Quran. In verse 22, Potiphar tells his wife, known in Islamic tradition, as I mentioned, as Zuleikha, commonly identified in Sufi sources with the soul that incites to evil, and nafs al-amara bisu, which comes from verse 54, that she should give Joseph honorable accommodation. As we shall see, Zuleikha also represents the lower self, but more specifically the passions. Now, I know some of you are thinking, oh no, the woman again as the seat of all passions and the negative dimensions of the human being. Allow me to finish, because you'll see that it's not like that at all. It's number one, it's not a woman or a man in this case, really. It's the human passions, but there's a great transmutation and alchemical kind of functioning of her own becoming that eventually comes to light of day, and she's on a much higher plane. She's my favorite character, by the way. And as in the case with Joseph's shirt, she appears 3 times in 3 different guises as well in the story, and her lowly nature here is eventually transmuted, as I mentioned, into a higher form of love shorn of sensual passion. If Potiphar symbolizes insight and Zuleikha the passions in this case, then his statement to her to give him honorable accommodation can be seen as a judgment by the soul in its newly realized state of maturity, that it can indeed partake in sensory pleasure, but of course within certain limits, and always under the purview of knowledge and good judgment. That is to say, as the soul seeks to transmute its base qualities in order to obtain the primordial purity with which it came into the world, it can partake in sensory pleasure within good measure, and which could in fact aid it on its journey back home. Yet there is always the possibility that excessive indulgence in the passions will throw one's focus off kilter and cause the soul to descend into deeper and darker states. This is to be kept in mind as we encounter the incident between Joseph and Zuleikha in verses 23 to 25. Joseph, at this stage in the story, represents the soul on its journey back home, and it has already undergone a considerable amount of spiritual preparation and transformation. Yet this soul still struggles with the passions, even if they are legitimate on one level. Zuleikha, as the excessive passionate element of the soul, thus possesses a certain kind of stronghold on the soul. A weaker soul will, in other words, give in to the passions, and thus cease to develop spiritually. But a soul that is stronger, one that has been given knowledge and wisdom by God on account of its spiritual maturity, will surely be better equipped to deal with the passions when confronted by them. That is why in verse 24, it states that Zuleikha indeed inclined towards him, and he would have inclined towards her had he not seen the proof of his Lord. So a very different reading from the one Raz here. Now we encounter that all-important character again, namely Joseph's shirt. At this stage in the story, Joseph's shirt is again torn from him, but this time by Zuleikha, or the passions specifically. That's in verses 25 and 29. The struggle that ensues between Joseph and Zuleikha represents, in the first instance, the struggle of the soul to overcome the passions, and to consequently strive in the truth and transcend the false self. But by the time Joseph flees from Zuleika, the soul has made considerable progress in overcoming the passions, despite its being pursued by them with great fervor. Now note that the shirt here symbolizes the earlier stages of the soul's actualization of the spiritual virtues. Note that it was torn from the back in verse 28, which alludes to the negative forces of the passions as they attempt to chase the soul and hold it back from making further spiritual progress. It should here be noted that there seems to be a sense in which Potiphar, who represents insight, is related to Jacob or intelligence. Firstly, insight is a lesser function of intelligence. Secondly, when Potiphar first sees Joseph, he refers to a possible parental relationship that may result by virtue of his taking Joseph into his household. Thirdly, just as Jacob will later go blind and have his sight restored by virtue of Joseph's shirt, we'll get to there in a moment, so too does Potiphar go blind and have his sight restored by virtue of Joseph's shirt. This latter point alludes to verse 28, where after seeing that Joseph's shirt was torn from the back, thus clearly indicating that Zuleika was guilty of attempting to seduce Joseph, Potiphar comes to accept Joseph's innocence. In other words, the battle of the soul with the lower passions can momentarily obscure one's spiritual insight, so that matters are not seen as clearly as they were before the onslaught of the passions upon the soul, as is here the case. But when the soul breaks away from the passions, literally running away from them in verse 25, and is able to objectively observe their potential harm upon it, symbolized by the torn shirt, its insight is no longer obscured, and it can therefore again see clearly. This explains why at this point Potiphar tells Joseph to turn away from this in verse 29. Now the women of Egypt, who were a rumor mongering with respect to Joseph and Zuleika, also represent the soul's inner struggle with the passions, even after it has overcome the passions on one level. Verse 31 has the women clearly mesmerized by Joseph's astounding beauty, which can be understood as the soul's ultimately seeing its primordial beauty, and thereby moving away from the passions and completely inward, that is, away from the world and into the sanctuary of divine remembrance and inwardness. This is why in verse 33 Joseph says that prison, here symbolized by the inward turn, is more beloved to him than that to which the women call him. It can also be noted that in verse 32, unlike the first time when she was caught chasing Joseph, Zuleika admits her wrongdoing, but she also insists that his failure to comply with her wishes will result in his being imprisoned. Now, normally this is understood to be a threat. If Joseph does not sleep with her, Zuleika will punish him by placing him in prison. But reading the different characters in the story as different aspects of the self, Zuleika first represents the passional aspect of the human self, as we have already seen. Then in verse 32, she represents that passional aspect of the self, now somewhat transmuted and integrated into the higher aspects of the soul, such that the human self comes to recognize that if it does not give in to the lower passions, it will enter into prison, which, as we have already noted, in this story represents the turn to the inward life. In prison, Joseph encounters some prisoners and helps interpret their dreams for them. In other words, as a soul turns inward into prison, it will naturally encounter others on the spiritual journey who require advice in their own lives and journeys. This meeting with the prison mates eventually leads Joseph to meet the king of Egypt, who releases him and makes him viceroy of Egypt, which was the very same function of Potiphar. And this freedom of the soul is thus a direct result of the time it has spent in spiritual retreat, thereby being called by the king, or what is known in Sufi literature as the hatif, the inward voice, to return to society in order to benefit others and to perfect the soul completely. As viceroy, the soul thus has the freedom to oversee its own spiritual affairs. And recall Joseph's request to the king in verse 55 to give him control over the storehouses, and has the ability to act righteously and to now look back to its original pristine state of purity. And in verse 51, the king confronts the women, at which point Zuleika admits that Joseph was innocent. Although she had earlier admitted to her wrongdoing, at this stage she simply accepts her actions and does not attempt to exonerate herself or threaten or blame Joseph in any way. That is, Zuleika at this stage symbolizes the passions now completely transmuted into pure detached love, fully integrated as they are into the higher aspects of the self. Now, just as Zuleika represents the ascending realization of the lower aspect of the self into the higher aspect of the soul, so too Joseph's brothers, through their long exchange, verses 59 to 82, come to symbolize the process of the death of the ego. Verses 84 to 85 tell us that on account of his grief over his beloved Joseph, Jacob's eyes had turned white. Since it had already been established that Jacob symbolizes the intelligence, how is it that it can become blind on account of Joseph, that is the soul? This is because without the science of virtues, one's intelligence amounts to nothing. The blindness of the intelligence can only be cured when it works together with the soul, which is to say when knowledge and virtue, or intelligence and will, are brought into harmony with one another. The practical lived aspect of the spiritual life here becomes a key piece to the puzzle. The soul cannot actualize its true intellectual potential unless it is perfected, at which point the clouds that cover the light of the intelligence will quickly vanish away, and the light of intelligence will shine forth. The soul that is perfected, characterized by the virtues, is one in which the ego is completely slain, such that there is no personal ambition on the part of the individual, and all things are done for the sake of God. Joseph's confronting the brothers in verses 89 to 92 thus symbolizes the final transmutation of the soul, whereby its lower or negative tendencies are overcome, and the other aspects of the lower self are also integrated into its higher aspects, such that they partake in the natural rhythm of the life of the soul. This is best seen in, for example, the integration of the body on a positive level into the substance of the soul, such that the body itself will become sanctified and is no longer a lowly substance in and of itself. With the lower self thus conquered, the soul is able to rise to the most beautiful stature, Ahsan al-Taqweem, 95.4, in which it had originally been created. The third and final instance in which Joseph's shirt figures in the story occurs in verses 93 and 96 respectively. In verse 93, Joseph tells one of his brothers to cast his shirt upon Jacob's face, and he will, as the verse says, he will come to see. The shirt worn by Joseph thus represents the full embodiment of the virtues, since they become firmly rooted in the soul once it has completely passed through the barriers of time, space, and the limitations of its own lower nature. Since the entire self is now integrated into a higher order, into its primordial disposition, or what they call fitra, the very body of such an individual exudes a fragrance. That is why in verse 94, Jacob is able to detect Joseph's scent, which is on his shirt, even before the shirt gets to him. In other words, the human being can be intellectually aware of the fruit of the spiritual life, but it needs the actual alchemical effect of the virtues to be actualized for it in order for it to see. And this is what happens in verse 96, where Jacob's eyesight is returned to him once Joseph's shirt is cast over his eyes. And the victory of the soul is perfectly prefigured at the beginning of the story of Joseph, when Joseph conveys his dream to Jacob. Although already with the soul at the beginning of his journey, the victory of the soul as manifested in the dream is something that the soul has to actualize by going through the lived human experience of separation from one's home, and then the journey to return to that home once again. Thus, as we near the end of the story in verse 100, the dream initially beheld by the soul is now something that it has realized on account of its overcoming its own lower dimensions, striving in the truth, and actualizing the virtues. The one question which remains is why the story of Joseph, itself recounted in what is called the most beautiful discourse, Ahsan al-Hadith in 39:23 of the Qur'an, why this story is referred to as the most beautiful of stories, Ahsan al-Qasas, in the beginning of the story of Joseph. This is precisely because the most beautiful of stories is the story, as I mentioned at the very beginning of my lecture, of the perfection of man, which is created in the most beautiful stature, from 95.4, Ahsan al-Taqweem. In other words, the story of the human being or man can be a beautiful story if the outcome is deliverance and the actualization of one's beautiful nature. The story of Joseph is thus the most beautiful of stories because it is potentially your story and my story, recounting through the symbolic dramatization of all of the story's characters how our souls may navigate their way about the rugged terrain of earthly life. Since there's a saying in the prophet where he says that God is beautiful and he loves beauty, surely the most beautiful story can only be about how God's beauty is actualized by that human being who is fully realized, and for whom, as verse 95:6 says, shall be a reward unceasing on account of God's love for him. And it is such a human being, having become truly beautiful in the love to God, who emerges as a victorious hero in the most beautiful of stories, which is the story of his own life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think the floor is open for questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, for the great talk. Could you, what's interesting about this surah, of course, and I wonder whether it had a role in your choosing it, is that it mentions hermeneutics within it, that it mentions interpretation within it. And I wonder, I'm just going to take this as an opportunity for you to tell me about something that that interests me. You mentioned ta'wil, of course, and you know Ibn Arabi's hermeneutics better than I do. But one hears very often about this dichotomy between two kinds of interpretation, ta'wil and ta'bir, of course. And one hears that they're in an antinomy to each other.
Yeah.
They're in opposition, right? And that one, i.e. ta'bir, is valued, whereas the other, ta'wil, is devalued, right? Could you nuance this a little bit? Because obviously ta'wil in this surah seems to be playing a rather different role. So
Yeah, sure.
tell
Yeah,
us
that's
about
a great
that.
question. So he's asking about the distinction that the authors draw in the literature between the word that we mentioned, ta'wil, and ta'bir. First of all, the first thing to note is that the word ta'wil, it denotes the going back to an origin. Ta'bir has a very different semantic field, right? It denotes the crossing over. Right? When you do ta'bir, you're moving from one plane to another plane. Now, some of the earlier Quran commentators who were concerned with the spiritual hermeneutics use the word ta'bir in preference to ta'wil. This is seen most, well, there are other authors, but the one author that comes to mind who has the most concern for ta'bir, and he even like derides ta'wil, it's Ibn Barajan, who's a very early Sufi figure, precursor to Ibn Arabi, and about whom now we have a book coming out in a couple of months, I think, or maybe in a couple of months, but sometime this year, by Yusuf Kaysar, who's at American University of Sharjah, where he studies Ibn Barajan's Quranic hermeneutics. And what's interesting about his Quranic hermeneutics is that he insists, as a Maghribi author, he's from the Maghrib, he insists that he's not doing Sufi tafsir. That's why I said earlier that the word Sufi tafsir, it's a really misleading term. And he actually says, no, Sufism, that's what they do in the East. We're not concerned with Sufism here at all. We're doing ta'bir. And what he really means is he's saying, I'm doing Islam. I'm trying to show how Islam works in these texts. So there's something of a response, I think, to what's happening in Khorasan, also in the 11th century, which is something else. But apart from venturing into the possibility of possible geographic emphases on each term, I think ta'bir is more common in the Andalus and in the Maghrib, and ta'wil you find more commonly in the eastern lands of Islam. That's a thesis that I'm putting forward. I'm not 100% sure if it's correct or not. Some authors tend to conflate the two. So that's one of the things that we should keep in mind, is that thanks to Henri Corbin, he's kind of left behind a legacy which makes us think that everything's just ta'wil. And I think that's somewhat misleading, because when you get into these texts themselves, even in Ibn Arabi, for example, the way he uses ta'wil and ta'bir, it's very different from the way Corbin makes it out to be. The word ta'wil often has to do with the return to an origin of something, and it can or cannot have to do with hermeneutics per se. It's often used by these authors without a scriptural basis at all. So part of the nuance is that these terms are somewhat interchangeable. Sometimes they're contrasted with one another, and sometimes when they are kind of put in opposition to each other, the emphasis upon one over the other really has to do with, I think, what is conveyed in the actual process of interpretation. So if you're trying to do ta'bir, I'm generalizing now, if you're trying to do ta'bir, you're trying to move from the basis of one scriptural statement to another scriptural statement, i'tibar, which may or may not be a spiritual reading. But if you're doing ta'wil, you're trying to take that one text in particular, and you're trying to kind of move back, so to speak, to the very origins of where that text comes from. So even in the very semantics of each word, one has to do with returning to an origin, the other has to do with the kind of crossing over, to one side of a river, for example. Where they come together is that ta'bir, it takes you to other associations of different contexts of meaning and terms that will take you back to an original meaning that the author is emphasizing. So it really all depends on what authors we're looking at. The only study that I've seen that tries to demonstrate, and I think it does a very good job in doing so, why ta'bir is probably a more effective word in terms of its usage in the textual literature, Sufi textual literature, is by Denis Ghali. He has an article that he wrote in French some years ago, where he looks at Ta'bir and he says that this is really the term that these authors are more concerned with, if you mean by the term going to other associated meanings to take you back to original meaning. Now in the Quran, the way it's used here in this surah, it has to do with the interpretation of events, ta'wil ahadith, right, going back to these events and giving their original meaning. So therefore it has to do with dream interpretation. That's often how it's used. And again, the science of dream interpretation, its more common term in Islamic literature is a ta'bir. So there's some degree of nuance, and I think that it really just depends on the authors that we're looking at. There are no hard and fast rules with any of these things. The one hard and fast rule I've learned with Islamic texts over the years is that there are no hard and fast rules. There are some hard and fast rules, but sometimes you'll see someone say, well, Ibn Sina says this, and he insists on that this term only means this, and you'll go read some text of his, and you say, he means something else by this text. Why didn't the author know it? We never read that book or work. So, it's a huge demand on one individual to read all the writings of one author before they can say anything. But there has to be some degree of just I think some degree of humility and being like, well, we don't. This is what I think the author's saying. It might be otherwise. Wallahu alam. So the wallahu alam is very important in all of this. I hope that addresses your concerns.
Yes, okay, we have
Go ahead.
that, and then
Just a quick question. So, would you say what you're doing here, or what Tafsir al-Qur'an is a mode of ta'bir?
Well, I wouldn't put it forth as being any kind of ta'wil. That's.
Well, I said ta'bir.
Oh, ta'bir. Yeah. I mean, yes. The word ta'bir, if you're looking at textual correspondences, would best characterize probably what I'm doing here, I think. But even then, the term that came to my mind when I was doing the research for this text wasn't ta'bir or ta'wil, but it was tatbiq, which is the art of finding correspondences between one passage and another. Again, that's another term that these authors, especially Maghribi authors, use, tatbiq. The Ikhwan al-Safa, for example, that's their primary mode of understanding scripture, can be understood as kind of tatbiq, or defining correspondences between all kinds of things, nature, the Quran, themselves. So I haven't really thought of the term that I would use to characterize this, but if we were to use a term, we would probably call it tatbiq. In terms of the operational principle, Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an, the safest thing to say about what I've just presented to you here is that it's just a manner in which we're trying to demonstrate how one part of the Quran kind of can cross over into explaining another part of the Quran in such a way that, as I've shown you, the anthropology that's laid out in a very kind of general sense of the term now allows you to engage in a much more deeper level of analysis with respect to this other text that's commenting upon it in the form of a story in this case. And this kind of thick or rich reading allows for the more general text to really come to life, so to speak. And that's the primary intention in the act of Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an, to allow for the more general to be made specific based on other readings of passages in the Quran.
Because the distinction you made between ta'bir and ta'bir remind me of basically the Lacan's contribution. He talks about how his problem with Saussure was that Saussure was so stuck with signifier and a signified, and his contribution was, well, the signifiers are always referencing each other, right? And this is an endless game until there is a moment of closure, and that moment of closure that is a moment when meaning is made. And it seems like, to read you in Lacanian sense, ta'bir would be references of these signifiers, different abur, until one meaning needs to be established, and that is the moment of ta'wil, which is, this is what the origin has to be.
Yes, perhaps, but that's an interesting point. But one must keep in mind that I think that what I've learned over the years with respect to the commentators is that aside from trying to offer final readings of any text, they are, I believe, the first people within the Islamic tradition in in terms of the Islamic sciences, as that's concerned, because they're concerned with scripture primarily as an enterprise. I think maybe the first ones to insist that there is no closure to the way scripture can be read or understood. It's a very common, your parents or this discussion has no end, right? So there's a sense in which once you've unraveled one layer, you just keep moving within the layers, and so on and so forth. And the purpose is not to get to an end, but to really just swim in that ocean. That's why Ibn Arabi, in one of his most famous texts, which is sometimes misunderstood if you take it out of context, he says that human beings will forever witness God and God's disclosures in this world and in the afterlife. So one of my students once was commenting, wait a second, does that mean I'll never get to be with God? Wait a second, I don't like that. I need something concrete to hold on to. And the answer Ibn Arabi would give is, well, you're not a real lover. A lover is somebody who goes towards the beloved, and in any of the modes that the beloved discloses itself, they're happy with. And if it's the infinite object of love, then that disclosure is continuous forever and ever. So that's why there's that common image of the zulf, the hair or the tress that falls upon the face of the beloved. When you move the hair, you see the face. But then what happens? Another tress comes up upon the face. You move that tress, and you see the face, and the second that happens, the other tress comes in. And he says that this happens for all of eternity. So the closure that some of these authors seek, like Khan, apart from the great, the aping gap between the two in terms of their own assumptions about the nature of things, one of the primarily significant differences between the two is that one is rooted in an understanding of the multiple correspondences between the human, between the subject and the object, by virtue of the science of self-transcendence, which allows for closure but also an opening, whereas the other doesn't have necessarily that at its disposal.
Okay, let's go to Jude. Yes.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation, sort of your take on the story and the interpretation, this whole idea of this story is like microcosm of the soul itself. So I have a question sort of either from your interpretation of it or from maybe the commentaries that you've looked at. The question is sort of why Zuleikha and why sort of love and why this sort of this specific physical desire or sex or this passionate. What's so specific about this test that it was this that the soul was tested with? That's Joseph was tested with.
Right.
And why it wouldn't have been, for instance, money or power or whatever else?
Right.
Is there something specific about this?
How do I answer that? Well, the thing is that Zuleikha, in the literature, they really make her out to be, she's a heroine in the story, right? She actually wins, not largely. There's all these tales, all these books that we read. Yusuf was Zuleikha by Jahmi, for example. Suhrawardi has a very beautiful reading of this whole thing in his Risala fi Haqiqat al-Ishq. I think one of the reasons that Zuleikha is a symbol of, first of all, the lower passions and then the higher passions is because in its fully transmuted state, it's a story of love. Dastan Ishq, what they call Dastan, is the story of love. And Ishq is that kind of thing that all human beings are concerned with. Sure, some people are concerned with money, other people are not. Some people are concerned with fame, other people are not. But I think it can safely be assumed, and our authors assume this, that everybody loves love on one level. What is it about love? It's such an amazing thing. And one of the debatable etymologies of the word for ishq, ashiqa, is that it refers to the vines of a tree that wrap around the tree and eventually choke it to death. So love has this kind of power to both vivify but also destroy and kill. And so Zuleikha becomes a symbol of all of these things, and Yusuf, as the authors often like to portray, is kind of an innocent bystander in this much greater game of love, which he's not even aware of what's really happening till the very end. But the central emphasis has to do with the fact that love is so important to the basic architecture of human life, and also beauty. Right? Love and beauty come together. And so this is probably one of the reasons. One of the things that the authors tell us is that the reason the story of Joseph is considered to be the most beautiful of stories is because it contains all of these elements that make life beautiful, right? It has faithfulness, it has forgiveness, it has patience, but also all the things that make a beautiful life, if you throw it into relief, also a very difficult kind of life. It has betrayal, it has envy, it has hatred, and when the two come together and there's a kind of overcoming of the negative elements, that's when that full beauty is realized, and that can only take place, as these authors tell us, through love. هرچگویم عشق را شرح و بیان چون به عشق آیم خجل مانم از آن گرچه تفسیر زبان روشنگر است لیک عشق بی زبان روشن‌تر است. Rumi says that although the commentary, tafsir, of the tongue can clarify, that love which is tongueless is of greater clarity. So this is the whole point. The first part is whatever I say by way of love, by way of commentary. When I get to the meaning, I'm ashamed by it. Although the commentary of the tongue clarifies, that love which is tongueless is of greater clarity. So it's about all of us essentially. We're all lovers, and anyone who says that they don't love, I think they're lying for sure. We all love something. It might not be. It doesn't necessarily have to be a human being. It can be a book. It can be. I hope all of us love books. That's why we're here. It can be something. Love is the principal thing. It makes the world go round. And often they equate love with wujud in the literature. Wujud, being, God, Rahma. They're generally synonyms, especially in Sufi texts, not necessarily in philosophical texts.
Jonathan?
Yeah.
Yes. While you were reading your translation, there's something that struck me in comparison with the biblical story of Joseph is that in the Bible, the brothers of Joseph are much more prominently described, and it sees that his brothers represent like different traits, negative traits of the human, such as like one is presented as a kind of wolfish, and these different traits, and they're rather central in what happens to Joseph. They're the ones who throw him down well, but in the Quranic story, they're more on the sidelines, and they're just like pulling the strings of what happens, but they're not central. And my question is, does this tradition expound on what the brothers signify?
Yeah, you mean like the commentary literature?
Yeah, like is there like, or what could be the symbolism that's attached to these brothers?
Yeah, the biblical account in that regard is much more deep. Even the figure of Reuben, for example, in the Bible, he's kind of like the voice of reason. Reuben and Judah together, it's debatable who's saying what in those particular texts in Genesis 38 onward. Each of them represent also some negative aspects of the self, but there's also some kind of element of, wait a second, this is wrong what we're doing. And the Quran, in a sense, just glosses over that. It just mentions in passing once, don't kill him, throw him in the well. When you get into the commentaries, most of the biblical materials is present in full force. When the study Quran is coming out in November, about which I can say a little bit later on if you're interested, I wrote the commentary on Surah 12. Not a commentary like this, but like just a very straightforward commentary based on about 40 of the traditional tafsirs and also some modern tafsirs. And when I first started getting into the material, I noticed that between, let's say, verse 17 and 18, whereas the verse would just have one or two words about what was happening, the commentaries give pages and pages of all the things that were happening between those verses. If you read the story, it's interesting. Like at one point, they're proposing to the father to take him out. There's some doubt about what's going to really happen. The next minute, they have him. They're with him in the wilderness. The next minute, they're showing up with false blood. Like what happened in between? Mm-hmm. So the biblical tale sometimes provides material for the commentators to use in the commentary. That's a very common feature. The authors also often in the literature, especially in Maybudi's Tafsir and other works that are more Sufi-oriented, if you like to call it that, but also not necessarily all the time, they will try to see in the brothers different kinds of correspondences to the negative human qualities. But because generally they're not localized in any particular way. There are no brothers that are specified by name in the story. Just one or two are mentioned, one amongst them. They'll kind of lump them all together. And then it's the work of, the Eisegete in this case to really try to expand upon that. So they can represent the ego in summary form, and if one is so inclined, they can try to pinpoint all the details. But that's not the narrative of the Quran, that's really proper to the Bible.
I think we have a couple of minutes, so we will go for Layla and then we'll go to Bruno. So first Layla. Oh, yeah, Hadi, sorry.
Well, just thank you for this talk. I was just wondering, you mentioned that this is the most beautiful of stories because it could be anybody's story. But Joseph's story is particular because he has a prophetic and royal lineage. And he is close to Jacob in a way and benefits from that, genetically or like just from his education. So isn't actually Zulaykha more of the generic any person?
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, well, if we're looking at, so there are several levels of the way we can understand the story, right? If we understand the story as I advanced here, where all these different individuals are different aspects of the human being, then there are no real distinctions between Joseph, Zulaykha, Jacob, the brothers. They just all represent different parts of ourselves. And we're like, each of us is like a unity, a human being. And we all have different things. I could be talking right now, I can be thinking, at the same moment I'm talking to you, although I'm not, but I could be thinking, oh, I can't wait to go to La Taj tonight, which is a nice restaurant. So there's all kinds of possibilities here that exist within the human being, even on a microcosmic level, right? Even a biological level, all kinds of things happening within our bodies that we're not even aware of. Some authors, yes, they like to emphasize not so much even Zulaykha, but Jacob. Jacob is often considered to be the great object of love and the lover in the story. So it's usually like a triangle of love with Jacob kind of at the peak. So it's Jacob, Joseph, and Zulaykha, and it's kind of an all-encompassing love relationship between them. Now recall also that when I put forth the idea that it's a story that's the most beautiful of stories because it's a story of the human self, that's not just a story of any human self. See, one of the things that these authors tell us, especially if we're doing this kind of reading that I've been trying to suggest, is that there's a very particular kind of self that's a story worth telling. Not just the ordinary fallen state of the human being. 95:4-6 says that the human beings have been created in the most beautiful of statures, then they're brought to the lowest of the low, except for those who believe and perform acts of righteousness. For them shall be a reward unfailing. So on that anthropological reading, it's people who really escape that lower human state. From the perspective of the escape of the lower human state, there's only really one kind of individual that would be the object of the most beautiful of stories. That is the human being that's beautiful in herself.
Hadi, please.
Yes. I was wondering to what extent you would consider your interpretation, which you describe as interpretation of the Quran through the Quran, as an allegorical interpretation of the text, where everything is representing as an allegory of the soul, of the exile of the soul, and of its tribulation, and then of its ultimate ascent. And I mean, you mentioned al-Hikam earlier, and I saw many parallels with your interpretation of the text with his interpretation of Ibn Sina's Hayy ibn Yaqzan and his interpretation of Sahrawati, and he contests the use of the word allegory, but and he uses tautagory, which is like this. The text self-interprets itself and carries its own interpretation. So I was wondering whether that's how you're using Quran interpreting itself, as in that tautogorical sense that al-Qur'an uses. And in that case, I have another question. But could you say something about that?
Yes, I will. I've read your work on Qur'an, so I'm familiar very much with. I've been reading Qur'an for many years, and I appreciate him on one level certainly. What he says there, in La Rajon Propre, and also in his Avicenne and the Missionary Recital, is definitely in line largely with what I've been doing here. I would tend to want to call it an autology. That's the term that if I were to localize what I was trying to say here, an ontology, a science of the self. One of the great differences between the reading that Corban advances in some of those aforementioned texts and what's being done here is that he's not concerned insofar as he's dealing with Ibn Yaqlan in that Ibn Sina book. He's not concerned with trying to relate it to other levels of interpretation of scripture. He's concerned with the artifacts in the story as so many aspects, again, of an architectural component of the human being. So that's the great difference. I also agree with him that the word allegory is kind of a little too plain and flat. I much prefer symbolism. And some people don't really see a distinction between them. I think among some of my colleagues who work in similar areas, we've debated in the past about should it be allegory, should it be symbolism. That's all open to discussion. I'm not really dogmatic about any one reading in this regard. But in terms of the what of it, I believe that the word ontology probably better captures what's happening because it leaves open the possibility for symbolic interpretation. It leaves open the possibility for allowing scriptural passages that seem otherwise completely unrelated to speak to one another. And then it also doesn't close off the possibility that we're concerned here with several levels of history. This is exactly what Corban is also speaking of in his writing, is that we're not concerned with a flat history, linear history of the human soul that's being charted here, although that's not necessarily to be denied, but that we're dealing with histories of the human soul as they develop over time in place and space. Does that answer your first question so that it precludes your second question, or do you have your...
Yes, it does.
All right.